Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. So we're coming up to the end of the gardening season. It might not feel like it with this glorious weather that we're having at the moment, but I think it's time to start thinking about what we're going to do with empty patches of land as we're coming up to the end of the gardening season. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm going to talk to you about green manures, or what we refer to them in America as cover crops. Cover crops are a type of plant that we intentionally grow to build fertility into our soil. Now, a lot of soils in this country all over the world are quite poor quality. They've been really heavily industrialized and farmed in a way that has taken out much of the nutrients from the soil and ruined the structure of the soil. It doesn't apply to gardens that are in people's backyards that have been heavily improved with compost, but that doesn't mean just because you've got good soil that you can't improve it any further. And when it comes to the end of the season, soil should always be covered, like I've got these spared, covered with a deep layer of wood chip. Now, you don't have to use wood chip, you can use any type of mulch that you want, but anything organic is going to always be the best thing to do. People do use plastics to cover them, and it has its advantages. You can use plastics and that'll suppress weeds, but you'll be leaching plastics into the soil, so let's avoid that sort of thing. So go for heavy organic mulches. Things like cardboard is good, wood chips good, leaves, grass clippings, even manure is good. But if you're going to use manure, I'd cover it with a layer of cardboard to prevent all the nutrients leaching out and causing pollution further down the stream. So cover it with something like cardboard, and that'll stop the rain from washing it through straight away. But the focus of today's video is green manures, and I've got a bag full of seeds in my hand at the moment. Now, there's a bunch of green manures that you can use, and they all serve different purposes. So I've got a packet of mixed green manure seeds, and it's got clovers in it, it's got ryegrass in it, it's got white mustard in it, and all of these have their own advantages. So clover is a nitrogen fixing plant. Now, the way that works is it takes nitrogen from the air and uses it something magical on its root nodules, a type of bacteria that form, and it takes that atmospheric nitrogen and fixes it to the soil. We've got ryegrass in here. Ryegrass is a plant that will grow big and it'll grow bulky, and it is a bit of a bully plant. And some people complain with ryegrass that it's hard to mulch out, so they have to dig it. And you can use no-dig cover crops, and this is exactly what we're going to do. With ryegrass, if you're finding it that it is getting quite big, just pull the root out, and if you've got nice loose soil, it'll pull out quite easily. Mustard's a brassica, and again, it's going to put on a lot of foliage, it's going to take out a lot of carbon from the air. So same with the ryegrass, because as plants grow, remember what happens, they use photosynthesis, so they take carbon out of the air, they put oxygen out into the atmosphere. But what they're doing is, when they're taking that atmospheric gaseous carbon, they're turning it into solid form carbon in terms of their body structure. And then when you're adding that back to the soil, you're actually adding carbon back to the soil. Now, normally, if you just leave a mulch, yes, you're adding carbon back to the soil in the form of the mulch that you're using is being eaten by the worms and then pooped out, and you're adding carbon that way. But what we're doing is we're combining the two methods. So we're using a deep mulch, and we're growing something that's going to produce a ton of nutrition for the soil and add a load of carbon and add a load of green, organic matter to the soil. So you could use a plant like buckwheat. Now, buckwheat is absolutely brilliant at adding phosphorus to the soil. Most soils are actually plentiful in phosphorus, but what you do see is that the phosphorus isn't plant available. Buckwheat's an absolutely fantastic way of taking that phosphorus that's already available and making it plant available. So it's available in the soil, but your plants can't access it. This buckwheat will turn that phosphorus into something that the plants can use and then grow from and give you bigger and better harvests. I generally like to use a mix of green manures into my soil because I want to do different things. I want to fix nitrogen. I want to take atmospheric carbon. I want to add it to the soil. I want to put a lot of organic matter into the soil. Because remember, I've talked about this quite a lot. I started on really, really heavy clay. This bed behind me is a new bed, and a couple of years ago what I did with it is I poisoned it with weed killer. And the way I poisoned this bed was I used a load of grass clippings that I got off someone who works as a commercial gardener. So he dumped a ton of grass clippings, and I just mulched this bed with it thinking it's going to be all right. But in actual fact, those grass clippings were poisoned with some kind of herbicide, and probably aminopyrrolide, because what it did was it completely decimated my potatoes. It decimated my squash last year, and the bed still hasn't quite recovered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw everything at this bed to try and improve it. And if you remember, I talked about me starting this garden on extremely heavy clay. It's really bad. It's almost yellow, you know. It's quite yellow stuff that I started working on. But we improved it to such a state that you can actually dig parts of it now with your hands. Think about the shape of the roots of the plants that you're going to be growing. With your grasses type plants, so your ryegrass, it'll grow a clump of roots. You know, the roots won't go down so deep. It'll grow a clump maybe the size of my hand, or the shape that I'm making with my hand, and it'll stay within that sort of area. Whereas something like clover will also spread its roots a little bit, but it'll form a much smaller root ball. So they're not really deep penetrating roots. So because this is still underneath the mulch, it's still quite heavy. I started on probably about 1 inch of topsoil. After the mulch, I probably got 4 inches of topsoil now. I've turned that yellow clay into usable soil. So what I want to do now is I want to try and deepen that soil. So I'm going to look for a plant with a root that's going to have the most penetrating shape that I can think of. Now, a good plant for that would be something like this. Now these are radishes, so these are a muley type radish. If you can grow these right, these will grow probably about 1.5 foot long if you can grow them right. We struggle to get them more than 1 foot or that sort of size. Now if I can get foot long radishes grown into here, and what I'll do is we'll obviously take a few for eating, but we'll leave a lot in the ground to rot in the ground. So the way the radishes are going to work is we'll cut them off at base level, we'll take a few for harvesting, but the others we'll cut them off at soil level and just cover them with mulch and just allow that radish root to rot in the soil. So that'll create like a compost corridor. It'll break down in the soil, it'll just open up the soil, and it'll just turn it into something that is much more friable, and the structure will be much better. But I'm not just going to go for radishes here, I'm going to go for a good mix. So I'm going to take a good amount of radish seeds, and I'm going to just scatter them quite thickly. I'm going to go for a really thick scattering of radishes. So you can see how I'm just happily scattering the seeds over the surface of the soil. But that's my radishes in. Now remember what I said about radishes, it's going to provide a good amount of organic matter. So we're going to get radishes that are going to grow into the soil, and we're going to get radishes that we're going to leave in the soil, but it's also going to provide a lot of foliage. Now that's a way of adding carbon, and it's a way of adding structure to the soil. But what I want to do is I want to add some nitrogen to the soil. So what I'm going to do with this one, I've got some tares, and you can see the type of seeds these are. And these are a nitrogen fixer, and again I'm just going to go for a nice thick sowing of these in between my radishes. So if you've seen the amount of seeds I've just scattered on here, yeah, it's really a deep layer of seeds. You know, it's because that's what you want. You want thick growth coming through here. Just work the seed into the soil with a rake. You don't have to do anything too fancy. I mean, this is generally the way I'd plant a lot of my seeds. So that's all of my seeds sown in this patch of the garden. What I'm going to do is, I wanted to harvest my potatoes from that side, but this weather has just sort of invigorated my squash and my fig leaf gourds, and they're just growing all over the place and taking over. So if I can manage to harvest those potatoes without damaging those squash too much, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same method and just completely plant this bed full of radishes and full of tares just in this patch. Now, different green manures are sown at different times. Use plants that are a little bit hardy, that are going to survive over winter, they're going to put on a bit of growth into autumn, and then put on a bit, go dormant in winter and then put on a bit of growth in spring when you're going to chop them down and mulch them out again. With something like buckwheat that I mentioned, now with that kind of plant, it's a better plant to be sown at springtime because it's slightly less hardy and you want it to grow on a little bit easier in milder conditions. So if you're going to sow squash in June, July time outside, plant them outside, and you're going to have an empty bed all the way from the start of spring up until that time without sowing anything, then sow something like buckwheat. It'll get that milder environment and it'll keep your bed growing. Remember my saying, remember what I always say, something alive is always better than something dead. I'm a big believer in wood chip, I'm a big believer in deep mulch, but I much prefer having a little bit of green alive over winter. It's more nice to look at as well, but it's adding carbon. It might, in the grand scheme of things, when we're talking about comparison to trees, it's not adding masses, but any little bit of carbon that it can take out and put it into the soil, let's do it. Let's do whatever we can. I mean, field beans is one that a lot of people like to use, especially in the States, and that's a fantastic way of adding nitrogen to the soil, another legume. Now, field beans is not something that I've managed to get my hands on over here. I substitute that with broad beans, so I plant a lot of broad beans, and I used to grow broad beans exclusively as a cover crop. But now what I tend to do is I grow broad beans and then plant them out in spring, and I give them a little bit more care because what I want to do is I want to get a harvest from them. What I'm going to do with this bed is I'm going to stick another row of broad beans down here, and then next year we'll get a harvest from broad beans as well. And I'll leave them completely unprotected outside in the elements. You could throw in some peas. Now, if you threw in some peas, you wouldn't throw them in for a harvest at this time, especially ones outside. You'd throw them in and you'd grow them for green manure. Now, I have started some hardy varieties of peas off, like Onward's a good variety. I talked about that in my what to sow in September video. A variety like Onward will be generally hardy variety of pea, and you can overwinter them and get a harvest next year. So what I'll do is I'll start pulling these potatoes out, and then we'll cover this whole bed with cover crops. Let's check on the cover crops that I planted in my what to sow in September video. These are seeds that you saw me plant about a week ago in what to sow in September, and this was just purely mustard. And someone asked me, is this an eating type of mustard? Yes, you can eat it if you want to, but this is for my soil to eat. And there's a couple of interesting things here. There's this patch here where generally I struggle to grow anything at all that hasn't grown the mustard. And what I must have done was pulled over the seeds over that side. And there's a patch here that I've missed with seeds. Brownie wants to star in every video. Okay, is she going to take over? Okay, fine. But this little patch used to be a footpath, and it's had a lot of compaction. We only turned it into a bed about 2 years ago, so it still needs a lot of work to it. It's fantastic. I mean, we've got a massive patch of strawberries, we've had beans, we've had all sorts of things growing here, but it's not in any way, shape or form seeds that you can grow something that's going to penetrate down into the ground yet. So what I'm going to do is, I've got the mustard growing, so here I'm going to chuck in some rye seeds, and I'm going to sow them quite heavily. Again, look how heavily I'm sowing them. You can see all the seeds falling, and I'm using a mix of rye seeds with vetch. So I'm not going for a lot of nitrogen fixes right here because I've grown beans here this season. So I've had little dwarf French beans here that we've had harvest from. You can see I've got beans there and I've got beans there right next to me. So there's a lot of nitrogen fixing going on here. So my key here is to break up soil and to add organic matter, because the mulch here is a little bit thin for my liking actually. I haven't planted potatoes up here yet, which is one of the things that I wanted to do this year. Was I wanted to plant potatoes up this side of the bed. yeah, and that would have added me the perfect amount of mulch that I wanted. I'm sad to say that this weather may not last much longer. We forecast thunderstorms maybe Monday, Tuesday, that sort of thing. So if we do get a little bit of rain around then, that's going to be fantastic to just get these things off and germinating and growing. We'll have plenty of time for these things to establish before the frosts come. I don't think September is going to be too cold. I think it's going to be a nice and warm September, and we'll get these plants off to a fantastic start, and we'll get some plants germinating, and we'll get things happening in this garden. I'm looking forward to it. Don't think of the end of the gardening season as an end of a gardening season. Think of it as a cycle. So we've just gone through the growing phase. We're still harvesting lots of things yet, but we're thinking about planting and preparing for next year and getting the garden off to a really good start for next year. We're thinking about ways to improve our soil, turn our garden into something that's rocket fueled, that's going to give us loads of production for next year. And you can see the scale I'm growing on. People say, have I got a massive garden? I mean, my growing space, the space that I use for growing is the size of the space that I use for growing is probably smaller than an average backyard. Yes, we do have the play area and we do have a corner plot, so it gives a little bit more of a garden, but the actual growing space is really small. But the amount of food that we are producing it's a serious amount of food. Yeah, I've never done any actual measures. One day I might be organised enough to do some measuring and weighing of what we're harvesting. See here, I've got some what I'd call weeds. I've got some dandelions popping up. I can't remember what this is called. I've got some plantain there. If you've got nothing else, having a weedy bed over winter is better than having nothing. Yes, it's a bit of work when it comes to next spring that you have to weed your bed before you plant your other things, but it's better than having bare soil. Remember that. Soil has to be covered. Soil wants to be covered. Now, if you can't cover your soil with something living, use something dead. Use some organic, use some organic material, wood chips, leaves, grass clippings, manure, straw, whatever you can think of. Find some organic material, cover that soil. And if you can't cover your soil, let the weeds grow and then just weed them out next year. It'll be much better for your soil to have something living in it. Soil wants to be alive. It wants to be part of that ecosystem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find patches like this. I'm going to weed that out and I'm going to sow cover crops into this whole area. We've got plants here. We've got kohlrabi, we've got cabbages, but there's a patch of amaranth that we've harvested over there. So we had amaranth in there. So at the start of the year we had I can't remember, we had lettuces in here I think at the start of the year, then we had amaranth in here, then we've had a harvest of coriander from here, and now I'm going to plant cover crops. So in one season I'm having 4 different crops into one bed. Yeah, you can't go wrong, man. You can't go wrong at all. So yeah, let's get this planted up with cover crops. Just at the side of my sweet corn I can see a patch of ground where there's nothing growing, so I'm going to sow some cover crop seeds into there. You can see the gaps in the sweet corn, right, where nothing's growing. Now at the moment it's covered with straw, and that straw is from the chicken bedding. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to remember nitrogen. Remember, sweet corn is a nitrogen loving plant. It's a grassy type of plant, so it's been sucking up all that nitrogen from those chicken manure that I put down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, I don't need organic material, because what I'll do is I'll chop this sweet corn, I'll shred it all up and I'll chuck it back on here, and that'll feed that a good amount of biomass. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some nitrogen fixing material and I'm going to put nitrogen fixing plants back into here. So I'll probably go for vetch again, and I'll go for vetch into there, and we'll be fixing nitrogen because we've taken out nitrogen. So if you're taking out an element, try and add that element back. If you're growing at one root structure, grow a different root structure. If you're growing one shape of plant, try and grow a shape of plant that's a little bit different. If you think about it in those simple terms, you'll be all right. You don't have to go into the real nitty-gritty of which ones got this much percentage better, not at our level. Maybe if you're an industrialised farmer and your life depended on it, your livelihood depended on it, that's a different story. But at our level, we can do these simple things by looking at plant shapes and plant structures and root structures and root shapes and what do they do. If we learn those little rules, we'll get far. There's a little bit about cover crops and what I'm doing right now with cover crops. I hope you've enjoyed watching what you've seen. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. And if you do want to support our channel, you could always become a patron. And I'll see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.